For tonight, we have very lucky to have our topic, Christian discrimination in academia. Dr. George Yancey is a professor of sociology at the University of North Texas. He has published several research articles on the topics of institutional racial diversity, racial identity, academic bias, and anti-Christian hostility. His books include Compromising Scholarship, a book that explores religious and political biases in academia. There Is No God, a book that investigates atheism in the United States. So Many Christians, So Few Lions, a book that assesses Christianophobia in the United States, and the book Hostile Environment, a Christian book that explores how Christians should deal with Christianophobia. He currently is working to create the first Christian Studies Center on a secular campus. Please help me welcome Dr. Yancey.
Do that sound all right? Okay, great. Thanks for having me. If I drift off from time to time, I have to forewarn you that I am the father of a 2-year-old and a 7.5-month-old. So yeah, I've renamed the 2-year-old I Destroy It, because whenever he sees something, he says, "Oh, how can I destroy this? You know, how can I run this into the ground, or how can I break this?" And my 7.5-month-old, I've renamed I Put It in My Mouth, because everything goes in the mouth. So my wife and I have been trying to, keep up with it, and I'm an older father, and so, parenting is a young man's game, I'm discovering, but I'm gonna hang in there best I can. But anyways, I just, I want to give a shout out to my 2 boys and to my lovely wife who makes this possible. Without her, watching the boys this evening, and those of you who are Christians here, you can pray for her. I would not be able to make it because I would have to be there to help them out. I love my boys, but they do create a lot of work. I want to look at the topic of Christian discrimination in academia, and as I looked at the topic, I realized, does it sound like Christians are discriminated in academia, or does it sound like discrimination against Christians in academia? And so, just to clarify, I'm looking at the latter. Do Christians face discrimination in academia? And I'm just going to give, my answer to that is yes, and now I'll spend the rest of the talk trying to show why I've come to that conclusion. But first, I'm sure see I get this correctly. Is that how we forward it? There we go. First, I just want to show this little cartoon, because I think this cartoon summarizes how some people think about it when we talk about discrimination against Christians in society in general. And in the first panel, if you can't see it, is a woman with a halo signifying Christian saying, "If you're pro-choice, you're a baby killer. Arrest somebody." And then, "Gays and lesbians are unnatural abominations. Stop them from getting married. Atheists are amoral agents of Satan. Put God in schools and courts. Show them we're a Christian nation. Somebody ban this obscene art exhibit." And then this person, evidently not a Christian, saying, "If you want to believe in God and teach your kids about Christianity, that's your right. Please just let the rest of us make our own choices too." And then we come back. "Stop persecuting and stop disrespecting my beliefs. Were you waging a war against Christianity?" And this is, if Christians talk about, hey, is there discrimination, this is one of the comebacks that people say is, well, what you all call discrimination is we're stopping you all from oppressing us, or you're just complaining because you're losing your privileges. So what I want to do is look at, and by the way, let me just stay up front that there are plenty of Christians who go overboard. And one word you don't hear from me is persecution. I don't talk about Christians in the United States being persecuted. If you want to talk about the Middle East, that's a different story altogether. I'm not going to besmirch what they go through. I don't talk about Christians in the United States being persecuted. I'm talking about discrimination, and we can argue, how much, is there a difference or not? I think there is. So there are Christians who go overboard. What I'm going to argue is, are there areas in our society where Christians do face legitimate discrimination? And we're going to look at academia as one of them. And if it's true in academia, then we can start thinking about, is it true in other areas of our society? I've been told I have 40 minutes, so I'm going to just take a look at my watch here and put it here so that I don't go overboard. I am a college professor, And I do know when students start getting the signal that, I'm tired of this professor, you start putting up your books and shuffling papers. I get that. You all thought when you were students you were fooling us. You weren't. You were not. So I'm going to make sure that I keep this within the time constraints. But I want to go ahead and I'm tackling this argument by looking at one area in which Christians may face discrimination. Because, and then we could, maybe Q&A we can talk about are there other areas as well. Okay. All right, I've given you the answer to the question that I see, but I don't want to just present the evidence that suggests that Christians do face discrimination. Is there any other evidence that shows that Christians do not face discrimination? So the best as I can find, and I try to keep myself well read on this subject, there's 2 studies that you could use to argue the contrary. So let's look at those. The first study comes from Neil Gross. It's an audit experiment. What he did was he sent out emails to graduate advisors across the country. And in the emails, he changed one thing. This is what we call an audit experiment. We change one thing and see people act differently. And the one thing he changed was from the student, did the student work, and the timing was during the Obama-McCain election. So did the student work for the Obama campaign or the McCain campaign? And he found that did not seem to make a difference in how people treated the person responding. So you're seeing letters of a graduate advisor, hey, I'm a student, I'm interested in the program. Change one thing, the Obama campaign and the McCain campaign, there's no difference. And so he concludes that there really is not any academic bias. And the reason why we have these differences in academia as far as more progressives, less religious individuals, is what we call self-selection. That those individuals select themselves into academia. Well, I actually wrote an article criticizing this as far as, he's focusing in on on political discrimination, but you can imply religious discrimination as well. And I actually wrote an article criticizing it. But I won't go through all that whole article. I'll just point out this one thing. And Gross actually admits this. He chose the McCain campaign. Anyone remember who McCain's running mate was? Sarah Palin, right. He actually explains in one of his early articles not using the Palin campaign because he felt that if he used the Palin campaign, people would not believe that this was a serious student. In other words, he used someone who, McCain is a Republican and a fairly conservative one, but also has a reputation as a maverick. Also has a reputation of, well, he doesn't always tell the Conservative Party line. Someone that's a little bit more acceptable rather than someone who really might illustrate whether or not there was a bias. So my argument is that this audit study really does not look at, it really doesn't go far enough in order to look at whether discrimination takes place or not. So that's my there's other critiques I have of it. I won't, because of my time constraint, I won't go all into it. I'd be happy to if someone wants to give me a question on that. But that's a big one in my opinion. If I'm going to test something and then come to the conclusion that there's no differences, I better make sure that in my audit study, the change in variable is strong enough that I can come to that conclusion. And I argue that it isn't. The only other study that even closely suggests that there's not discrimination is a survey by Rothman, which is interesting because I'm going to use some other research of his later on. And they survey students and professors on different campuses, and they ask, have you faced bias? And they find that a relatively low percentage of individuals have faced bias. And it's a little bit higher if you look at conservatives or religious individuals, but not that much higher. And so they conclude that the bias is not very strong. And I think they may be right as far as students, although I question that as well. But the problem is that the way they define religious political groups is very general. For example, that they look at Protestants as a whole category. Now, Barack Obama's a Protestant. Farwell's a Protestant. Would they have the same experience on a college campus? And I think what we're going to find when I look at other information is it matters what sort of Christian you are, whether or not you might run into this sort of discrimination. So that becomes a problem I find with this particular study as far as becoming this definitive answer. These are the only 2 studies I can find, and if someone has other studies, I'm actually interested, are there studies that contradict my point of view on this? But these are the only 2 studies I can find that even suggest that there's not discrimination of Christians on college campuses. All right, so what I wanted to do is start looking at some of the evidence that is. And I'm going to start with my own research because it's the one I know the best, obviously. The research I'm about to look at comes from this book called Compromising Scholarship. I'm not a good enough entrepreneur to have brought copies to sell. So, my wife, is going to say, hey, where's the money? I'm a sociologist. What do you think I am? But this is where this research comes from. I did a question. What I did was I sent this question to professors all over the country in certain disciplines. And I don't know if you can see it clearly, but I'll just go ahead and read it really quickly to you. Assume that your faculty has hired a new professor. Below is a list of possible characteristics of this new hire. Many of them are characteristics that you cannot directly inquire of the prospective candidate. However, if you're able to learn these characteristics about a candidate, would that make you more or less likely to support their hire? Please indicate on a scale of 1 indicates characteristics greatly damages your support to hire a candidate. 4, doesn't make a difference. 7, enhances. And then if you don't know, then just indicate such with non-applicable. So if you don't actually know, you can just say, I don't know, what you're describing, I don't even know what that is. So these are the groups I asked about. I think 26 different groups. You can see, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, political, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, transgendered, atheist, Mormon, fundamentalist, evangelical, mainline Catholic, Muslim, Jewish. And then I got cute, vegetarian, who knows, whatever. Hunter, I thought, hey, if I find something here, man, I can have a whole book, married, divorced, cohabitating, single child. And then I wanted to look at some age stuff, so over 50, under 30, that sort of stuff. So I just, threw a lot of stuff in there. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, but I think it covers quite a few different ways people may discriminate against others. And then I was curious about sciences and humanities, so if you've done social science research, you can't do everything unless you got a huge, $1 million grant, which I did not have. So I selected these disciplines: political science, anthropology, history, physics, chemistry, experimental biology, philosophy, language, non-English and English, and sociology. I had to do sociology, you got to call out your own when you get a chance. So that is what I did. I sent this out to all these different professors. Understand a few things. I'm asking these professors, actually asking them, are you going to discriminate based on these things? I'm not tricking them. I'm asking, hey, would you discriminate based on these sort of things? So, what did I find? All right, let's start with the sociologists. By the way, remember, they have the out. They can put 4, which means it doesn't matter. All right, so you have to remember that. All right, I selected fundamentalists, evangelicals, NRA member, Republican, Muslim, and atheist. This half is enhances, this half is damages. So to read this, the top line, fundamentalists, 50% of the sociologists, if they find out a person is a fundamentalist, it damages their willingness to hire them. Now, it varies. Some say slightly, some say moderately, some say greatly. All right? And in the book, I break it down more on that. But 50%. Evangelicals, it's a little bit under 40%. And then you can go on down the line to NRA member, Republican, Muslim, and atheist. If you look on the other side is, if I find out about this person, it enhances my willingness to hire them. And among fundamentalists, I think there's one person. Looks like there's maybe 1 or 2 people there. And then, it's pretty low up until atheists, and then it gets up to about 8% or something like that. So among the sociologists, we can see that when asked if they would be less likely to hire someone, if they're a fundamentalist or evangelical, a significant percentage of them say they're less willing to. So, English academics, same pattern that we see as before. I'm going to go through these kind of fast. A very similar pattern there. Political scientists. The scale changes a little bit, and there's a little bit different pattern there. Historians, same basic pattern. Here the NRA members caught the evangelicals, so, historians don't like those gun toters. Philosophers, same basic pattern. They like the Muslims a little bit more, but other than that. Chemists. Chemists, none of the chemists want the fundamentalists or evangelicals. Maybe one or two want a Republican, and then you can see that the atheists have some support. And once again, the chemists do not like the NRA members, but still not as bad as the fundamentalists. Physics, once again, a similar pattern. Muslims get a little bit of a bump up there, but basically the similar pattern. Experimental biologists. Experimental biologists don't like anyone but atheists, you can see on the enhanced side. And then they really don't like the NRA members. But a lot of the similar pattern. Now I put all the academics together. And you can see with all academics together, it's not surprising that we have this pattern of this rejection of fundamentalists and evangelicals more so than the other groups. The NRA members are pretty close. So conservative Protestantism is the group that's rejected the most. On the other hand, there's little enhancing except for maybe some Muslims and atheists. When you look at the Republicans, they're rejected, but not as much as the religious groups, which indicates to me that, and honestly, I went into this thinking that it would be more political bias than religious bias, because as a sociologist, I know of Christian sociology groups. I don't know of any Republican sociology groups. There's no, coalition of the Republican sociologists that I know of. There is an association of Christians teaching sociology. So I thought, hey, they're going to hate the Republicans, maybe hate the Christians, but not as much. I was wrong. Don't tell my wife I said that. The hostility is more religious-based than political-based. So what we now know is that when asked, academics will tell you they're less willing to hire you. About half of them are less willing to hire you if you're a fundamentalist. About 40% if you're an evangelical, they're less willing to hire you. If we're looking at the sciences and humanities, it's less for the hard sciences. It's more for the social sciences and humanities. So there are differences that are there. But this is sort of the reality that we're looking at right now. Okay, that's one piece of evidence. Obviously, it's not the only evidence that we have out there. So let's begin to look at some other research. First research I want to look at is Imbar and Lammers. Now, in 2016, they did a survey of just social psychologists. And they're studying political diversity. They found that only 6% of social psychologists are moderate and only 4% are conservative. So this is not new. We know this about academia. They found they're more liberal on social issues than economic and foreign policy issues, which I find is interesting because there's other research out there that shows that when Christians go into academia, especially in the social sciences, the areas in which they become more progressive on are economic issues and more conservative on are social issues. About 3/4 of who they survey, of these social psychologists, are willing to discriminate against political conservatives while reviewing their papers, grant proposals, and in hiring them. So what they did was, I looked at a variety of different disciplines. They looked at one discipline, but they asked more than just about hiring. They also asked about if you're reviewing an article. And if those of you in academia know, that if you are in a research institution, getting published is how you keep your job, how you get promotions. So if someone's going to be biased against you reviewing your article, that's almost as bad as not hiring you at all, because you won't be able to keep a job in a research institution. Grant proposals, once again, that's very important to get money to do your research. Also, grant proposals can help, are especially important when it comes to getting positions at higher level institutions. Remember, political conservatives are more accepted in academia than conservative Protestants, according to my research, according to different disciplines. So what this suggests is that the dynamic that we saw as far as hiring probably applies to conservative Protestants when it comes to their papers, getting it published, grant proposals, things of this nature. This is not just a one aspect element. This political hostility, by the way, they document is fairly hidden to those who don't experience it. So if you are a fairly progressive to very radical social psychologist, you don't see this. It doesn't affect you. So what they found is that those individuals who are not moderate or conservatives didn't perceive any problems in academia. And it's not that they were bad people. It's not that they were awful people. It's just that it didn't impact them, so why would they perceive it? Rothman and Lichtner, remember I used his survey before? They also did a very interesting study. They assessed the occupational status of academics. University of North Texas is considered higher than, say, a community college or some four-year school, but University of North Texas is not as high as Harvard or Yale. We aspire. We're not there yet. But there's different statuses in academia. So they assess the occupational status of academics. They found that academics who are socially conservative have lower status academic positions. Well, there's a couple of reasons why this could be. It doesn't be discrimination. It could be because they don't produce as much. But the results held after demographic controls and controls for productivity. So control for productivity, how many articles they publish or however you measure productivity, academics who are socially conservative had lower status academic positions. What this suggests is that social conservatism, as I've suggested in other research, tends to be linked to the religiosity of academics. So while they didn't directly measure religiosity, and one of my critiques of a lot of this research is they don't measure the religious status well enough, this is an indirect way of looking at it, and it suggests that there is a systematic effect of the biases that I documented before. The result of that bias is that if you are socially conservative, you're going to probably wind up in a lower academic position than if you were not, regardless of your publications, of what you do. And now, I want to look at an anecdotal case. Notice I've not brought an individual case yet. I think too many times Christians bring in a case of someone who got, worked over, and they say, hey, here's evidence. Well, no, it's an anecdote. And it's only useful for me, and I believe in qualitative research, but it's only useful once you have quantitative work to back it up. I think I have the quantitative work, I've demonstrated that backs up this anecdotal case. Some of you have heard of Mike Adams. He's a criminologist at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He's a former atheist who became a Christian. And he's a columnist at Town Hall. Now, you're probably familiar with Town Hall. It's a very conservative, some may even say hyper-conservative website. He writes there. I've read his stuff. Funny at times, pretty biting at times. He was denied a promotion to full professor because of Town Hall writings. Now, what's interesting is that this wasn't said up front, but when they went to the court case, they were able to discover that this was the reason why he's denied his promotion. Promoting his Christian faith, promoting his ideas in Town Hall was really the reason why he's denied his promotion. He won in Eastern District Court in North Carolina. I bring up his case, not because it's the only case I know about, but because it was brought to a court and it's public knowledge, I can talk about it. I know of cases that I cannot talk about because it was decided outside of court, and I'd be violating confidences about it. So I won't answer questions about other cases directly for that very reason. But this is public knowledge. This is out there. Found that his writings were illegally part of the decision to deny his promotion. When you go up for promotion, you're supposed to be evaluated on your academic work. Whatever you write outside is not supposed to weigh in to why you're promoted. However, they brought that in there, and that's why he was denied his promotion. So now we have at least one case that we can just say, we know that the discrimination impacted this one case. So the evidence we have is about half of academics will openly say they will discriminate against conservative Protestants. About half, maybe a little bit less if you're looking at evangelicals. we know that there's systematic evidence that these conservative Protestants are in lower status positions, even after controlling for productivity. And we have at least one case that we can talk about, that we can openly talk about, where it's clearly the case that this person was discriminated against because of his Christian faith. I think that's very powerful evidence that there are problems with discrimination in academia. I want to touch a little bit. In fact, let me just suggest this. If we put this sort of evidence on another religious group, what would the outcome be? For example, if we knew that about half of academics stated that they're less willing to hire a person who's a Muslim, and that Muslims do worse controlling for all different factors, occupational status, and we actually have a case of a Muslim who's discriminated against, we talk about academics as being Islamophobic, or if we're talking about Jews, or if we're talking about atheists. If half academics say they're less willing to hire someone because they're an atheist, and we have a case of an atheist who is discriminated against, and we know that systematic atheists are doing worse, would we not say that that's unfair? I think we would. And so how can we not say it's not unfair if we change the religious group out? I want to just briefly talk about Christian students because that is another factor. The evidence isn't quite as strong because there's not that sort of systematic evidence that I like to be able to back things up with. I think there's room to do better work on this. So, I'm not quite as strong on this, but there is some work out there on it. Gunn and Zinner Jr. Had anecdotal accounts of religious discrimination in the selection of medical students. They looked at how people were justifying their selection of medical students, and they found that there was religious bias in some of the decision-making that was taking place. Higher and Higher found students were less sympathetic for Christian discrimination than for anti-black and sexism. And what's interesting about their work is the events described were the same. So an African American would describe an event on how he or she was treated, and a Christian would describe it, and it would be pretty much the same. And then there was less sympathy for how the Christian was treated, even though the events were fairly the same. Schultz interviewed Christian students, indicated they see themselves as a chilly atmosphere on college campuses, that they have this perception. We talk about safe spaces, groups being comfortable. So I think this is very pertinent, that if we're going to talk about that, and by the way, I'm not a fan of the whole idea of safe space. I tell my classes there is no safe space here. If you have problems with different ideas, this may not be the class for you. But if we're going to talk about that, then we need to talk about all groups that don't feel safe, right? And then Ressler and Hodge, perceptions of whether a social worker was ethically compliant was lower with those with conservative theological orientation. Now, we can either conclude that those with conservative theological orientation are more unethical, and I think there's some other evidence and other research that suggests that's probably not the case, or there's a bias there. So there is some evidence. It's not as strong as I think the stuff with faculty members, but it's worth noting that it probably is the case that the bias that happens among the faculty does impact the Christians to some degree. All right, now I want to try to explain why I think this bias is there, and for that, I moved from my compromising scholarship to the So Many Christians, So Few Lions, where I look at Christianophobia in the United States. My work on Christianophobia makes suggestions that may give us an insight as to what might be happening. People with Christianophobia tend to be more highly educated, more progressive, and more irreligious than other individuals. People in higher education tend to be more highly educated. Obviously, you have to have a PhD to teach at most universities, progressive and irreligious. So it's hard to not believe that there's not an overlap that is occurring here. So it's part of what's happening is Christianophobia, which I define as an irrational fear and hatred of Christians. Okay, select the characteristics of those attributed to Christians by those with Christianophobia. In other words, these are some of the stereotypes those with Christianophobia have. These are only a few, and they're the ones I think are more pertinent to the case at hand. And I'll show you where I'm going after I just look at this. For example, those with Christianophobia talk about Christians being intolerant, want to take over society. A lot of them talk about Christians want to have a theocracy, being irrational. being anti-science. Now, these are only a few of them. Now, why am I pointing this out? Because, hey, maybe Christians are more intolerant than others, okay? You know, there's some research that makes this argument. My argument is that I think these stereotypes are in people's minds when they consider how to treat Christians in society. And just to illustrate this, it's a fact there are certain crimes African Americans commit more than European Americans. That's a fact. I don't want to be judged by that fact. I want to be judged for who I am. You know, if I come and I look like I'm about to commit a crime, then okay. But I want to be judged for who I am, not by this sort of fact that's out there. Likewise, it seems to me that if we're going to see what's happening in society, in academia to Christians, they should be judged on individual cases, not on... Now, I'm not conceding that this is true, but I'm saying even if it is true on the margins, it's not a basis for whether we hire someone or not. I don't want to be not hired from a job because, hey, African Americans are more likely to commit crimes. He's black. Maybe we don't want to hire him. Okay. I also did a study that's not in this book. It was a follow-up study that I did where I sent a survey out to academics. You know, I keep sending surveys out to academics. They keep answering them. You think they learn after a while, hey, isn't that from Yancey? No, I don't want to answer that anymore. And I asked them to rate different Protestant groups and then explain why they rated them the way they were and the difference between the different Protestant groups. So I got a lot of pretty cool qualitative data. And so one of the features that came out when we looked at conservative Protestants, because that's one of the groups I asked them about, was these factors that I just illustrated. For example, intolerance. This is a male healthcare professor, aged 56 to 65. Talks about extremely hypocritical, intolerant, bias against disadvantaged people in the United States, extremely conservative, intolerant of others, social choices, preoccupied with sex and sexual outcomes. He's talking about evangelicals or fundamentalist Christians. A female humanities professor. Their opinions seem extremist and often appear intolerant of other people and ideas. They do not seem to want to engage critically with important questions. And then a male history professor, age 66 to 75. They can sometimes be disruptive and intolerant on campus, especially in settings of religious diversity. I've also seen them proselytizing the cafeteria and other gathering places. So one of the qualities that people with Christianophobia see in Christians is intolerance. These professors also attribute that to conservative Christians in their answers. Want to take over society. Once again, many of the people with Christianophobia talk about Christians want to set up a theocracy and this sort of stuff. This female social work professor live in the Bible Belt where fundamentalist Protestants have placed an egregious constitutional amendment on our May 8th election primary ballot to further ban gay marriage and all domestic legal unions, not between a man and a woman. I'm enraged at their attempt to build a literal conservative theocracy. Now, she wasn't just complaining about the ballot measure. She sees the ballot measure as a step towards theocracy, which was a common idea that came out in the work on Christianophobia. They ruin the promise of our country. We replace a free society with theocracy, says a male math professor aged 46 to 55. Irrational, stupid. Belief system based on resistance to logic and information, intolerant of others, says a male medical professor, aged 46 to 55. They are totally irrational and often filled with hatred towards anyone who does not share their views, sort of like a Christian Al-Qaeda, which is also kind of a way of, say, taking over society as well. And by the way, I got Al-Qaeda in my other study as well, so sometimes when I was reading this, I was like, hey, it's like I'm reading my stuff on Christianophobia. Some of it, obviously not all the professors this way, but I'm just showing you that there was enough of them. And remember, you know, in my original sample, about half would discriminate against, which means there's those who would not. The belief in biblical liberalism results in, and they say other stuff, then irrational anti-science viewpoints. And that's a male medical professor, age 36 to 45. And then finally, anti-science. Here in the US, fundamentalists tend to be anti-rational, anti-science, a male medical professor, age 56 to 65. Right-wing on social, economic, and military issues, somehow justifying those beliefs with the Bible, do not generally believe in evolution, but rather creation. And for some reason, I couldn't get the information on that person. I think they didn't answer those questions. As an evolutionary biologist, I dislike the opinions on science education that sometimes comes out of that tradition. So they're against science. Now, what I think is that, I have to be careful because I don't quite have the data to strongly say how strong Christianophobia is in academia, but I think that it is a part of what's happening. That some of the stereotypes, some of the images are with these individuals when they think about possibly hiring an evangelical fundamentalist. And if you think that you're trying to hire someone for your campus, you think they're irrational, you think they're anti-science, you think that they're bigoted, you're less willing to hire them. And it's not that, although I think for some it may be, it's not that, well, you're a Christian, I won't hire you. You're a Christian, you have to prove yourself to me a little bit more. In other words, if things are even, you're not going to get the position because you're a Christian. Now, you're saying, well, you don't know that because you can't ask people that. And that probably used to be the case. But if you're online now, you can put people's names in. You can find out, punch my name in. Obviously, I've been around the block a time or two. But even, if you ever worked as a youth minister, for example, that could come up. If you ever write a blog on something, that could come up. I tell my Christian students, don't tell them you're a Christian when you go out for a job. I shouldn't have to. But I tell them, don't tell them you're a Christian when you go out for a job application. And, if you have something online, there's nothing you can do about it at this point. But it is what it is. So, I think I'm going to make it with the time. Let me just conclude. My conclusion is that there's strong evidence that Christianophobia is a problem in academia. It's not as conclusive as the fact that there is discrimination, but I think it's there. One day, hopefully, someone will give me big bucks, and we'll be able to study it. That bias can account for the evidence that Christians face discrimination in higher education. This sort of bias would not be tolerated for any other religious groups. I've already pointed out that if we had this sort of evidence for any other religious group, there would be more of an outcry. I honestly believe that. And that is the end of the show. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take some questions in a little bit.
Dr. George Yancey. We're going to now have a Q&A. So here is how this is going to work. These are the rules of Q&A. You can line up right over here where basically this stool is. You're going to be using the mic that I'm using right now and face. I see that camera right there. Basically, you're going to be talking. You can talk to Dr. Yancey from right there. I want a 2-minute question. All right, no diatribe. If you want to go into your own deal, call Ezra, and he'll set up your own Bible and Beer Consortium. All right. So just a quick 2-minute question for Dr. Yancey, and then if possible, maybe a follow-up question if it comes to that. So we'll be set up right over here, and whoever wants to take the first stab at it, come on over. Yeah.
Dr. Yancey, appreciated your talk today. Appreciated what you have to say. I do have a question about what you would recommend. You're outlining the issue, and I don't know that you are particularly trying to present what we should do, but if you had, but I would like to ask you that. What would you recommend in this in regards to this? Would you recommend, for example, political will to add some laws, or would you recommend simply enforcement of current laws, or would you even recommend maybe rescinding things to, and this would be, I guess, a two-part question. Number one, what would you recommend? And number two, what would you say if someone recommended, instead of possibly adding some extra laws to make sure that this discrimination does not occur and such, what would you say to the possibility of, say, stepping back on some of that and allowing the marketplace, allowing the marketplace to make those decisions rather than, a politician deciding, well, since I'm going to decide you're discriminating, I'm going to, pass extra laws to this. So those two sides of that question, please.
Okay. I don't know if laws is what we're looking at, because part of what's happening is the dynamic of just the natural, normal biases people bring into these decisions. I don't know how I could craft a law that really deals with that. I think at this point in the process, awareness is the most important thing to do. The more we're aware that this is an issue, then the more we can try to deal with it. I'm aware that I have biases that I bring into my decisions. I don't want to portray myself as, I'm a computer. If I have 2 job candidates and one's a Longhorn and one's an Aggie, of course, get rid of that Aggie, it's gonna be the Longhorn. But in all seriousness, I think being aware that we're biased, I think the problem we really run into, and a serious problem, is that the people who tend to have these sort of biases, be it in academia or in general Christianophobia, tend to be individuals who don't see themselves as having biases. And I think awareness is the key, because when we realize that we all bring biases in there and how powerfully those biases can impact us, then I think we have more of a chance of dealing with the issue. So I'm not looking for more laws. I mean, we already have laws in the books. You literally cannot discriminate on religion when it comes to hiring at a state school. That's literally against the law. But that doesn't stop it from happening, of course. And I have anecdotal evidence beyond, atoms of ways it may occur. I have a student who went for a job up in Utah. And when she was brought on a job interview, they specifically asked her, would you like to have coffee or tea? Well, the reason why they asked her that she realized, even though she wasn't a Mormon, they were trying to figure out if she was a Mormon, because Mormons don't drink caffeine. So, so stuff like that happens, and I don't know if laws can control it. Awareness is, I think, what we have to focus in on at this point. I hope I answered your question fully.
Dr. Yancey, thanks for coming this evening. I've enjoyed our Facebook conversations. One thing that jumped out at me was I'm a white man in a white normative society, and I know this isn't the main focus, but I think it may be relevant. You said one thing that resonated, that people who are more liberal, more progressive, they don't experience this discrimination, so they don't see it and might even deny it. Are there some parallels where people like me, I don't have racism in my heart, and I'm not receiving it in the way society is? Are there some parallels there? And again, I don't mean to derail the topic.
I understand. Yeah, it's interesting. You asked an interesting question, because my career is interesting, because for most of my first half of my career, I studied racial issues. And I looked at and I have books out there on race and how an approach on how to deal with it. And now I'm studying issues of bias against Christians. There are parallels, but I'm always cautious because they're not identical. I don't ever want someone to say, "Oh, you're saying that white Christians are like blacks in the South." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." But there are dynamics that are similar, and I think you're on to one of them. When I deal with whites with a more colorblind perspective and try to help to understand why that's not always helpful, part of it is they don't experience life as an African American in the United States, and therefore they don't see things. And that is not a knock on them. That does not mean that they are these bad, evil people. It just means, just like for myself, I don't know what it's like to be a woman in the United States. And so it doesn't mean I'm an evil person if I'm insensitive to the realities that women face, because I don't know what that's like. Likewise, I think for a lot of progressives, they're not bad, evil people, but they don't really fully realize what it's like to be a Christian in academia. And therefore, it's easy to dismiss it. And so I do think that, with some variations, is alike in these two situations.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yancey. I follow your information on social media. So I have a question from something that you said. So you tell your students, and these are Christian students, to not tell their potential employers that they are Christians. And the reason that's confusing to me, so I'm not an academic, I'm just a mommy that reads a lot, and I'm a mother of many, and I'm a homeschooler. So at some point, I will be sending my children off to, you know, the wolves. At least for me, I'm an ultra-conservative Christian. And so I want to understand how your research would help someone like me, because what you said is confusing, and the reason why it's confusing is because for someone that is sold out to Christ, believes the gospel fully, I don't muzzle myself. Christians don't stay in their own lane. That's just not what happens. And so you tell them to not tell anybody that they're Christians, but at the same time, you're talking about what's happening on college campuses really all around the world, but specifically here in the United States. And I've seen so much aggression going on that I want to understand how to help my kids before I send them off. They can go wherever they want to. They're not sheltered, but they're going off anyway. They're going to these secular universities. So I'm just trying to understand kind of, that, for me, that's a confusing message. Okay. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
All right. The students I'm talking about are graduate students who are trying to get jobs on universities. Your students are trying to get into universities. I don't think that the issues I'm talking about are as pertinent. You know, I don't think that, you know, they're not going to scrub social media for your students. They're going to go on how well their writing sample, how well they did on their SATs, you know, these sort of things. You know, I don't think so. Now, I'm not studied it.
Can I pause just for a quick second?
Yeah.
So I have a daughter that wants to be a doctor.
Sure.
And then I have one that wants to be in public policy. So at some point, they are going to be graduate students. Yes. And so this is
important. At some point, yes.
Important.
At that point, right. At that point, then they have to make those sort of decisions. Right. When I say on the job market, I don't think it's wise if you're going to a job market on a non-Christian campus to tell people that you're a Christian. That doesn't mean I'm saying you have to be Muslim the rest of your life. I'm not. Here I am. Hey. But I do think that is wise at that point, because you want to be evaluated for your credentials, and you don't want to bring something else into it. Now, you bring up an interesting philosophical question, all right? You get the job, you don't tell folks. At what point do you tell folks, or what point do you let it, you know? For me, I was fairly quiet till I got tenure. And I'm still not an abrasive type of person, but I'm not going to hide any longer either. So every person has to make their decision on when they're going to, you know, let the light shine out from under the bushel. I just don't think, I think that in this market, honestly, to get a job in academia, it is so tough right now. You don't need anything to keep you from getting a job in academia. It really is a tough market right now. Getting into grad school, it may be a factor. I'm actually kind of doing some research that might look into that, you know, whether or not being a Christian hurts you going into graduate school. I do believe it hurts you going to get a job, and so at that point, I think it's wise to not do that. But everyone has to follow their own counsel. You know, maybe you want to say, look, you know, if they're not going to accept me, I'm a Christian, I don't want to go work there. That's fine, just to understand that's going to make it harder for you to get a job. That's just the reality of this sort of situation.
Well, I mean, as a holy roller, I would say, you know, you're not trusting God, but I feel like the wisdom there is fake it until you make it kind of thing. You know what I mean?
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
Or proclaim it later on. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Hi, Dr. Yancey. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I am right here. There you go. Okay, hi. My name is Andrew Ledbetter. I am a tenured professor at Texas Christian University in Communication Studies. I'm also an evangelical Christian. I am politically conservative. So I very much resonated with your talk. And I know I have my own stories. I know I've talked to Christian colleagues, graduate students, faculty that have their own stories. But I've also, as you've talked about, I've talked to progressive scholars that are people of goodwill for the most part. And like you said, they just don't really see it. They'll readily admit discrimination against other groups to which they don't belong, be those racial groups or gender groups or what have you. Yes, I see that discrimination, but then when you talk about, well, as a Christian in academia, I've experienced this, they'll blow that off, they'll dismiss that, they'll try to draw false equivalencies and so on and so forth. So As a fellow social scientist that is interested in communication, I'm just curious if there's anything that you'd recommend that a Christian scholar, be they a graduate student, a faculty member, could say to a progressive scholar of goodwill that might help them realize and have that insight into the reality of that discrimination.
Thanks for your question. I think when you're dealing with scholars, you have to deal with evidence. One of the reasons why I wrote this book was I did the research for evidence, and I wanted to put it in a format where people could actually read it and have it. And so, the evidence in this book I think is strong, shows as far as a willingness to discriminate based on the other stuff. I do have a couple of blogs out there that where I compile. You may want to Google "Revisiting Compromising Scholarship." That'll take you to a blog where I compile some of the evidence that is there, because we know that anecdotes it's evidence, but it's not overwhelming evidence. But I think the way I laid it out, as far as you have people who say they'll discriminate, you have the effects of discrimination, and you have case studies of discrimination. It's kind of hard to deny that something's happening there. And what I have come to the conclusion is that the evidence of discrimination is so powerful that it's hard to deny that it happens. How much it happens, I think, is debatable. We can debate whether this is a huge problem or a minor problem, but we can't debate it's hard to say it's not a problem unless you can find other evidence, unless you can somehow dispute this, unless you can say, if I slip Jew in there, we're not talking about anti-Semitism. So I think that is the key, is to provide evidence rather than, I had a student who had a professor tell him that, I don't want Christians, I don't want to work with Christians and stuff. And people say, well, that professor's an idiot, but that doesn't mean it's a systematic problem. This is systematic data, which I think is more convincing than those sort of stories. Because, like I said, I do think there are people of goodwill out there who would be open to looking at this, but they're just not convinced because they don't experience it and no one's presented them with the right evidence to convince them.
I especially appreciate how you've made your case in a very evidentiary way here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Doctor, thank you. I appreciate your speaking here tonight. I had a question for you.
Into the lights.
I had a question for you. Anecdotally, what I've seen is it appears that there's been a shift in the demographics over time. And I don't know, first of all, I guess my first question is my observation correct that this is more pronounced now than, let's say, it was 30 or 40 years ago? And if that is what your observation is, do you see that as more of a reflection of society in general, or what would you see as the cause, assuming that part A is a correct observation?
Okay. To your first question, has there been change over the last 30 or 40 years? I don't have longitudinal data, so I cannot answer that question specifically as far as bias. I do have some data on Christianophobia, and there does seem to be some increase of that lately. And some of that, a little, but not as much as people are saying, but maybe a little bit. And some of that seems to be due to people. One thing I didn't put up there is that another group of people that tend to have Christianophobia tend to be people who are wealthy. Well, that's a recent development. I didn't put that up there because academics don't tend to be wealthy. Trust me on this one. I have personal experience on that. So what we see is, I think that there's some evidence of that, but I don't know if that really pertains to academia per se. Without longitudinal data, I really can't answer it. And what was the second question? I forgot. I'm sorry.
That increase, did you see it as sort of reflecting society's changing in general?
Yeah, like I said, without the longitudinal data in academia, I can't answer that question either. So, sorry about that.
I just thought it was really interesting how there was a distinction between prejudice against fundamentalist Christians and prejudice against, it seemed like, more liberal Christians in your presentation. And I'm wondering, this is kind of maybe more speculative question, but I'm just wondering why you think that difference exists.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a difference. You know, us call conservative Protestants as opposed to mainline Protestants as per se. And when I ask questions of mainline Protestants, they don't show up hardly at all in academia. So there is that split. As to why, you know, and I would go back to my work on Christianophobia. I think that the forces that drive that sort of resentment it's driven towards certain perceptions of conservative Christians. You know, I don't have the best answer for that because I've not really been able to drill down as to that source. I can speculate as to what that source is. There could be competition for resources, that the conservative Christians are competing resources against the progressives who tend to have Christianophobia. That's one possibility. It could be that because conservative Christianity was so dominant for so long and now that it's not as dominant, that there's sort of this built up, you know, hostility towards them for some things conservative Christians have done as well. You know, I'm not just saying that they're just totally innocent, but I say that that could be part of it as well. You know, it's hard at why. I do think that part of the reason why, though, and this is some more recent research that I'm doing on progressive Christians, because I'm kind of curious about that, is that progressive Christians tend to, their alliances tend to be more political than theological. So when I ask questions to progressive Christians as to, you know, how they rate groups, they rate non-Christians, progressive groups higher than Christian conservative groups, which indicates to me that their alliances are more political than theological. And so what may be happening, and if I had to make an argument, which is still speculation, but make an argument, it would be that there's probably less hostility towards progressive Christians because on the political issues, they are with the academics and they're with those with Christianophobia, so they're less threatening or less of a competitor. So that would be my best guess at this point.
I just was also curious real quick, what do you think about the popular discourse in this in movies like God's Not Dead, you know, the movie that was made about how creationists are being shut out of, you know, academia a few years ago? Expelled, yeah. What do you think of it? Do you think that discourse is helpful to this discussion as far as, you know, prejudice in academia, or do you think it kind of is inaccurate? Like, what's your general take on that?
I would like to see more Christian movies that are well made. I think, you know, I think you can get message, and I'm not an artist, so I'm not the person to do, you know, I'm gonna do it in the academic end as far as effective cultures, as far as the artist end. You don't want to hear me sing. I would like to see. I think sometimes Christians, and some of it may be because they felt so shut out that when they get their chance, they got to really, you know, hit people over the head. I think movies are better when the message is more subtle. You know, I think there are some good ways you could do it. I'm not saying God's Not Dead, so I'm not going to make a judgment on that movie. Expelled, I did see it. I was like, and then I punished myself, and I saw this movie called Persecuted, I think. You know, it was awful. So I actually would like to see more Christian movies, but I would like to see them well made. And I do think there are Christian artists out there who could do good movies, and that would have a message that would resonate, but you know, a little bit more subtle message rather than just, hey, you know, evil professor hates Christians, and you know, it doesn't do much for me. So.
As a person who's considering
into the light, my son.
Sure. As a person who's considering putting children into public school, I'm kind of curious what you think the effect would be on people that are being trained as teachers in universities, and what duration it might take for there to be real change, and if there might be change over time.
That's an interesting question, and it's an interesting question to ask a man who's a father of a 2- and 7-month-old, because they will be going to school really soon, and you know, I think that you just have to evaluate each school district on its own merits. I've told my wife that if we were in California, we probably would not put our kids in public school. You know, I think that there are some problems with the California school system beyond some obvious problems, but some of the stuff. In Texas, we moved to a place because we like the school system, so we're going to try, and as parents, we're going to be very proactive. You know, I'm all for diversity of ideas and stuff like that, but just like you don't want if you're a non-Christian, you don't want a Christian telling your kid, Jesus is the only way. You don't, as a Christian, want non-Christians telling them things like your values. And so as long as they're teaching them what they should teach them, history and reading and writing and stuff like that, then, and they do a good job with that, then we're going to be very satisfied. And so I'm just going to be proactive with my kids. I'm very concerned about that. If we have to pull them out of school, we will, but I don't think we'll have to. But I just think you have to evaluate each district, each situation. There's no cookie-cutter answer to this as a Christian, from my point of view.
I'm in the light now, so all right. Professor Yancey, just a quick question. You've been talking a lot about academia specifically, and not in the whole culture, discrimination against Christians, just throughout all of American culture. And I wondered, is there anything specific about academia that makes it sort of more prone, maybe, to these topics you're talking about, or is this something that you've noticed throughout all of culture?
Okay, that's a really good question. And is my mic? Okay, that's a really good question because I use academia as a way to look at this. Now, I'm not saying that the rest of society is like academia, because it's not. The reason why I think academia is more vulnerable is it matches the characteristics of people with Christianophobia. It tends to be more progressive, tends to be less religious, more highly educated. We could think of other institutions that are that way. I strongly suspect we might see something like that in perhaps maybe media or something like that. There's not been a lot of really good research on that. I've looked at that because I'm actually doing some work looking at some of those factors there. Perhaps in the entertainment world, we might find that. The business world, probably less so. So I think that we need to be selective when we're talking about some of these problems. There are areas where Christians do have an advantage. Politically, Christians do have an advantage. Donald Trump says he's a Christian. Why? Not from his lifestyle. It's because he knows that you're going to have to do that in order to be elected president. And I know that I'm going to get ripped right now from some of my friends who are Trump fans, but they already know me. Either they love me or they don't. But he has to say that because that's how you get elected president of the United States. So Christians do have advantages in society as well. And I'm not trying to say, woe is me, we're like the blacks in the 1920s, because we're not. But there are areas, and I think that you look for the areas based on the characteristics of people with Christianophobia. So you're looking at areas that are highly educated, white, male, is other factors that come, progressive, this sort of stuff. And I think there are some areas that are like that.
Hi, Dr. Yancey. Thank you for what you had to say. As a homeschooling mom, and as someone who has mixed ethnicity, I appreciate what you had to say. And my first question was already asked by the pastor in wondering where you were in the process of uncovering bias. Are you just there to say this is there? And the question was asked, what's your solution? And so what kind of response do you expect from this is both the what, and also do you have any concerns with the response to the reality that in this circle of time, we now as Christians who had incredible freedom and blessing now come under persecution or bias or wherever it is on the scale of that happening. And the reality is that in Scripture we're called to suffer. We will share in Christ's suffering. And so I wonder if the information is just thrown out there in a reactive culture where we push back from the reality of suffering, we stifle and hinder the capacity to mature. And so I have a concern with just throwing out words like phobia and then reacting like a group of victims.
Right.
And so I wonder, what do you have to say, and do you have any concerns as a strong, black, educated man, who my father was as well? And I also come from Cherokee descent, and so I can identify with many people who have been conquered and oppressed and who are rising up. And so which way will you choose? And do you have concern about the response to the fact that, yes, now in the United States, land of the free, home of the brave, Judeo-Christian worldview, we are now experiencing some pushback? Thank you.
I think your question taps into a larger issue, and I actually have talked and written on this. My Christian book that was referred to deals with this more extensively. Of course, with 40 minutes, I can't go into everything and do everything, so I'm not trying to neglect the answer per se. I just had to present, and just to keep it in a nutshell, my basic idea for Christians is to rebuild the Christian community. Part of what some of you may have heard of the Benedict option. I'm a fan of some version of that. I've read the book. My critique of the book is that it comes from a more of an orthodox perspective, and I'm more of an evangelical. So I would like to see some version of that, that's more evangelicalized. This is not saying woe is me victimhood, but saying, we have our community. We need to get our stuff together. We need to build our community. And by having a community that, that has our values, that is wholesome and healthy, we would attract people to us. I'm not a big proponent of a huge political pushback except to defend our rights. I'm already out as not a Trump supporter, so I might as well go ahead and go full board. I think it was a huge mistake for Christians to support Trump because it's sort of looking for this political solution that's not there. I think solutions are within ourselves and within our communities. Doesn't mean that we don't care about others. We do. In fact, part of the community is how we care for the marginalized. This is a larger conversation that we have to have. Maybe they'll have me back to talk about the Christian community. But that's sort of the direction that I'm going in. I'm not presenting this so that we can have this great political weapon, although we may need it from time to time to protect ourselves. I'm presenting this because I want other Christians to know, okay, we live in a post-Christian society. What does that mean? And for me, what it means is that we got to look more to each other and building this community strongly. So that's kind of where I come from it. And like I said, it's something that I brought up a little bit in my hostile environment book, and I actually did some more writing on fleshing those ideas out a little bit more. But that probably won't be out for a couple of years. But that's sort of the direction I've been going, talking with other Christians, looking along those lines.
Hey, Dr. Yancey, thanks for your talk tonight. Just to get my cards on the table, I'm entirely sympathetic to everything you had to say. I don't dispute any of your findings. I am curious about your definition of academia, because you've seemed to say that someone is a member of academia just in case they are on faculty at some university. I consider myself a member of academia, although I don't have a university post, but I've published numerous peer-reviewed articles in various journals and received a major research grant. And I've published some other stuff under pseudonyms. And I guess that's part of my question to you is it seems like one of the strategies that Christians could take to avoid some of the confirmation biases that you've talked about in your own research is just to say, let me make sure that this, when I'm submitting it for peer review and it's submitted for blind review, that it can't be traced back to me in any case. So I use a pseudonym, and when somebody tries to Google that name, even if it's an editor before they send it out to a reviewer, it doesn't get back to me. And then it's just some mystery name, and as a result, it makes it through the process, and then it gets accepted, or sometimes it doesn't. But as the case might be, this seems like a step that is necessary for Christians that might not be necessary for someone named Muhammad. And I'm curious if you would advocate that Christians should take those steps and try to protect the integrity of the research in order to try to get published, or if you would think that that's not a wise approach at all.
Well, I'm not going to criticize what you're doing because it's actually it's working for you. I will say, though, that won't get away from the bias, because the bias, I believe, happens at the level of peer review. And we saw that with Inbar's and Lawmer's work, that there's a bias there as well. So that may get you away from a bias as far as whether you have to get hired or not, but still, as far as getting your work out there, you still have to go through a peer reviewer. Like I said, in my career, first half of my career, I was dealing with racial issues. Second half of my career, I was dealing with issues of hostility to Christians. I'm a better researcher now than I was when I first came out of graduate school. Just repetition have done it. I have a harder time getting published now than I did with dealing with racial issues. So, when I was dealing with racial issues, I was pretty much in the paradigm of the academic field. I had a couple of wild-haired ideas that people go, oh, he's kind of crazy. But I was pretty much, in the paradigm. Here, I'm almost outside the paradigm. It's hard to get published. So that is the piece that I think that you don't get away from with pseudonyms. Now, that's working for you, and that's great. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, and your solution doesn't, deal with the whole peer review process, which has been critiqued a lot, justifiably so. And here's another issue that you have to consider in it.
So just to follow up on that, and I agree with everything you said. Am I not? Sorry, I'm not in the lane. I'm curious about this. I'm a Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, God-fearing, born-again Christian. I think Jesus was born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, and was raised from the dead. Like, historically, it's not just a story we tell. I think it really happened. But I understand that publishers have a responsibility to make money, and that they all operate within a certain capitalistic framework. And so if I submit to them a manuscript that editors look at and they think, if I publish this, I'm not going to make any money, it's not going to be good for them. And sometimes I think that it could be the case that we say, oh, they don't want to publish my work, and it's a case of anti-Christian discrimination. But sometimes it might just be a simple economic decision that they make. I'm curious if you might have any thoughts about that.
Well, I've never been an editor of a book, but my understanding is that when it comes to academic books, they publish a certain amount that they know they're not going to make a lot of money because it furthers the field. Now, they also publish stuff, that is controversial, spectacular, will make a lot of money, so that they can publish the other stuff. So the bias is going to work itself out one way or the other as far as that's concerned. And when it comes to academic books, a lot of the ways that they make their money, for example, this is a hardcover book. They make their money selling this book to libraries. Now, it's also great if you all want to buy it, but they'll get a certain amount of money, almost any topic, just by selling to libraries, because hardcover books, unfortunately, cost more money. So I don't think that the profit motive, while it's there, is what's driving some of these decisions. I think the decisions are much more due to the sort of biases people bring into them. Thank you.
I'm going to be an equal opportunity offender with this question. I was raised an independent fundamental Baptist, staunch Republican. And as I've gotten older, I haven't given up my conservatism, but I've added to it. I've added the progressive liberal perspective, kind of a both and. So I would say I'm an independent who leans holistic with a bias for well-being for as many as possible. So with that being said, I take issue with the Democrats and the liberals permitting Bill Clinton disrespecting the office of the president with indecency when he was being impeached. And I also take issue with evangelical Christians that ignored the warning of the famous or well-known author Max Lucado, who came out with Decency for President. And I think many of those concerns have proved to be founded. So my question is, when a tribe, any tribe, decides to make short-term compromises for political expediency, excusing indecency, it seems that it has long-term repercussions. So I'm wondering, to what extent is some of the anti-Christian, fundamentalist Christian biased, how much of that is related to Trump, and how much is it related to what Christians believe and value as conservatives?
I can't blame Trump for the bias because it pre-existed him.
Good point.
But I do think that there are long-term consequences to what's happened. That 81% is not going away anytime soon, and it's going to be used against Christians. And you can rightly argue, justifiably so. There are a lot of individuals, and even though I'm not a white evangelical, obviously, I hang out with them, and I and a lot of other conservative Christians leaders were saying, do not support Trump. Do not support Trump. And part of the shock for us was there's so much pushback to Trump that a lot of people did it anyways. That a lot of the non-leaders did it anyways. And so a lot of us are, where do we go from here? I will say this. After the election, I actually spent some time listening to people as to why they voted for Trump, especially Christians why they voted for Trump. Among the reasons, it's not the only reason, among the reasons was a fear. And I don't want to let them off the hook completely, all right? Because I do think that it was a bad decision to make. That's just my opinion. But Clinton didn't help with her deplorable comment either. And those people were not fooled into thinking that she did not mean them. She did mean them. So I would say, as much as I want to bag on the white evangelicals for doing what I think they're wrong, I do hope that the Democrats will at least try. Obama, for whatever else he did, he at least tried to reach out to the white evangelicals. And so I think that matters. And so I would like to see both sides to sort of try to lay down their arms, which I think is going to be a hard time as long as we have Trump as president. But, I don't disagree with you as far as your critique. In fact, I agree with your critique on both ends of it. So, we're not in disagreement there. I'm just saying there is a little bit of, I'm trying to defend just the smidgen.
Yes.
But for the most part, yeah, that 81% is going to be around a long time.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Dr. Yancey, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Tradition we have at the Bible and Beer is, how can the board pray for you?
Well, beyond having the strength to maintain catch up with our two kids, you could pray for the Christian Studies program. I would like to establish something on a non-Christian campus, a Christian Studies program, just like you have Islamic Studies and Jewish Studies. So, if we can find the funding for it, I definitely would like to establish that. So if you could pray for that, I sure appreciate it.
Okay. Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Yancey.